everybody, and welcome to a new video. Today we are on to the late 40s and early 50s in our rock evolution tree adventure, and if you haven't seen episode 1, you should probably go do that. It might be helpful. In episode 1 I talked about mostly just blues and jazz because that was a big part of the 20s and 30s, but we are now on to the 40s and early 50s. So let's get started. So today we're going to start with skiffle because that's what I started talking about in the last video as a little teaser for what was to come, but we have a lot to cover today. A lot of different kinds of music. Skiffle originated from blues and jazz, as I said in the last video. But I did research this time why it's called skiffle. So, the name was originally assigned to jug bands who didn't just play on jugs. Young kids in Britain were excited to find a kind of music that could be played on a cheap guitar and a washboard, which explains a lot of why skiffle expanded more in the UK than in the US. So apparently the name skiffle was just like, cuz. Now, although skiffle wasn't yet the closest thing to rock and roll, before rock and roll, it helped lead into a lot of the beginnings of rock and roll and the first few rock and roll bands. A man named Lonnie Donegan decided to record a different version of Leadbelly's Rock Island Line in 1954. Now, I talked about Leadbelly last time and his influence on blues, and he had a lot of folk kind of sounding music. So that's probably why this guy, who was originally kind of more of a skiffle and folk artist, decided to record this. The record was bought by millions of people, including young John Lennon and Paul McCartney, therefore exposing them to African American popular music for the first time. This was one of the first bricks laid for the house that is now rock and roll. So yeah, although skiffle, weird name, weird kind of music, was actually extremely important in forming what rock and roll is today, because as we know, without the Beatles, rock and roll would be a very different place. Or maybe not have existed at all, or really took off at all. So now we're moving on to doo-wop, which is a style of music that I have not personally been exposed to a lot. Personally, not a big doo-wop kind of person, but I'm still going to talk about it because it's important. Doo-wop is a style of rhythm and blues and rock and roll vocal music based on the featured tenor singer, backed up by a trio or quartet creating the harmony. The term doo-wop was created from the sounds made by the group. The beginnings of doo-wop style can be found in the early recordings of the Mills Brothers and the Ink Spots. The Mills Brothers often used vocal harmonies to simulate string and or reed sections. The Ink Spots established the importance of tenor and bass singers and even influenced some of the rhythm and blues artists and bands to do the same. The style was very popular in urban communities in Chicago, Baltimore, and New York in the 50s, for a similar reason that skiffle became popular. It could be performed, to put it simply, a cappella. Doo-wop helped create rhythm and blues. So, a very common theme in a lot of the beginnings of these kinds of music that I'm talking about is that they were easy for youths to play on easy instruments like a cheap guitar or a washboard, and especially for doo-wop because it's mostly just singing. So it was easy for everybody to kind of the kind of music to take off and start going, because it was easy for young people who were listening to this kind of music and kind of creating what was going to become rock and roll. It was easy for them to play this stuff because it was I'm not going to go out and buy a $2,000 guitar or a really expensive drum set or something like that. It was go in the laundry room, get a washboard, and you're fine. Moving on to rhythm and blues, which I also began to talk about very briefly in the last video. So clearly you should go watch that because you need to know what's going on. Rhythm and blues is a term used for post-war African American music and some white rock music that was derived from it. The term was first used by Jerry Wexler in 1947 when he was creating the charts for Billboard and found out that the record companies issuing black pop music considered the chart names that were being used to be demeaning. Wexler used the term rhythm and blues as to encompass lots of contemporary music forms of the time. Rhythm and blues is the basis of basically all of the styles that came after it. I know, it's a lot, but for those of you who have listened to a lot of rhythm and blues, whether knowing it or not, it's not like a simple style, but a style that can have many variations of it. And it really, like, without rhythm and blues, rock would have never been a thing. I feel like that's just a fact. Like, because it's such a specific style that came from jazz and blues that's so similar to rock without being rock. So, and plus lots of people who were in the R&B scene in the 50s became more of rock singers and guitarists in the 60s. So now I'm going to talk about somebody who has definitely changed the way I look at music as a young person, because I watched Back to the Future an unhealthy amount, which I would recommend watching. It's a very good movie. But Chuck Berry. And for those of you who don't understand why I'm talking about Back to the Future, Chuck Berry wrote Johnny Be Good, which is the song that Marty plays at the Enchantment on the Sea Dance. I couldn't remember what it was. Chuck Berry was one of the first men in rock and roll, oftentimes being referred to as the father of rock and roll. He was, of course, an R&B man. However, his music transcended generations and began the rock and roll world. He earned his fame from songs like Johnny Be Good, Maybelline, and Memphis. He was able to combine the worlds of black and white music together in a single song, pulling his inspiration from blues and jazz icons like Nat King Cole and Muddy Waters. Chuck Berry, he is like another very important thing that came from rhythm and blues that helped create like worlds of music. So rockabilly, it was very much derived from rhythm and blues, although they're very different. But it originated from blues and rhythm and blues, which, I mean, it's just a lot of blues. Rockabilly originated by white performers in the American South, earning its name from the very literal meaning of rock and roll played by hillbillies. I mean, I don't think that's a compliment, but I mean, you can take what you can get when you're naming a kind of music. It was an intense and rhythm-driven music style that was popular from the mid-1950s to the 1960s. It gained popularity from radios broadcasting R&B and gospel music, causing North American working-class musicians to mix black music styles with the country music they were already familiar with. This music was originally labeled as Western rhythm and blues, but became better known as rockabilly, despite the mostly derogatory connotation of the word hillbilly. The rockabilly style was one of the first nuances of rock and roll. So yeah, although personally not a huge rockabilly fan, it is like one of the first like versions of rock and roll that like came from the rock and roll style, although it hadn't necessarily really been named like this is rock and roll yet. It was still kind of like in the beginning stages of forming. Now, I wanted to emphasize how much that youth culture of the time really helped to create rock and roll, because there was a bunch of young people and there was types of music that they could play. And together that kind of helped to create the world of rock and roll, although I know not everybody who went to like rock and roll concerts in the 60s and 70s were like really young people. But the original people who were young in the 50s and possibly 40s were people who went to rock concerts in the 60s and 70s because it was so similar to the music that they had heard as children, which gave more, like, I guess, energy for rock and roll to run into the 70s and 80s. Also, it gave teens, no matter what decade it was, a way of like speaking out without being knocked down because they were saying something that was wrong. It allowed so many people to just like speak and talk about the problems they cared about, even if it was just in a musical form, because music has such a capability to just like move people, and it gives light to so many problems that it probably wouldn't have had their light on them. Last time I talked about New Orleans as one of the main cities that jazz was doing its thing in. So today I want to talk about Chicago, another very well-known place, especially for its blues and its rock and roll. Chicago blues is a kind of music that uses variety of instruments in a way which heavily influenced early rock and roll music. Chicago was a place in the 50s that held the wholly electrically amplified guitar, bass, and piano. This phenomenon was traditionally used in Delta blues, but Chicago extended this use. The Chicago blues changed the standard 6-note blues scale. They added notes from the major scale and dominant ninth chords, therefore giving this blues style a jazz feel. Chicago blues is also known for its heavy rolling bass. So we've already established that Chicago blues is kind of jazz. No, it's still a form of blues, but it's a very jazzy form of blues. But what I think is interesting is how similar Chicago blues is to like rock and roll. And you can probably see this in songs like Sweet Home Chicago. That's a good example, as it in the name. But it's like it's really close to what rock was in the the beginning, so like the late 50s, which I haven't talked about yet. The Great Migration was taking place during this time. It was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural southern U.S. to the urban Northwest, Midwest, and West. A lot of West. Chicago was a popular city for these people to move to, bringing their musical traditions with them. The Chicago blues style would not have been possible without these people. Chicago also had a distinctive style of jazz, which came from the Great Migration, because those who were living in New Orleans brought New Orleans Dixieland or hot jazz styles. Whoever named it hot jazz, I love that person. The style had emphasis on solos, faster tempos, string bass, and guitar, which oftentimes replaced tuba or banjo. The saxophones also shined in Chicago-style jazz and mainly derived from the New Orleans style of jazz. When these Chicago-style musicians started playing 4 beat measures, they laid the foundation for swing music. And I'm not talking about swing music yet, but I will. So it's really crazy, honestly, that just changing your measures into 4 beats instead of 2 or 3 is like mind-blowing and became swing music. Savoy Ballroom is a place that is very important in history and the changing of music between like jazz and to swing and to rock and to stuff like that, because it was kind of like almost like a database for all the different types of music that were currently, and it was like almost updating everything into like rock and stuff like that. Savoy Ballroom was owned by Mo Gale and Charles Buchanan and opened March 12, 1926 in the middle of Harlem. These 2 men created one of the first racially integrated public places in the country, therefore attracting a wide clientele. The staff of 90 permanent employees at the Savoy included their musicians. The 2 bandstands allowed for continuous live music all night and provided for many Battle of the Bands events. One of the most memorable of these Battle of the Bands events was Chick Webb versus Benny Goodman, when both bands were at the peak of their careers and popularity. The Savoy was so popular that even the great jazz musician Thelonious Monk played there. The long success of the ballroom changed music trends from Dixieland, ragtime, jazz, blues, swing, stomp, boogie-woogie, and bop to countless Peabody waltz, one-step, two-step, and rumba variations. The ballroom also changed the dancing trends to fit this new variation in music. And there's the Savoy Ballroom is not the only example of these like changing music through like a place, like a physical place. There were many different types of like bars, ballrooms, and stuff like this where it was racially segregated, so there was a very wide variety of people, but they were all connected, whether they knew it or not, through these types of music that they listened to. So the changing and the variations that came from these places is really just showcasing what the racially segregated places did to people and how it really allowed people to kind of come together to make different kinds of music and to create music together as opposed to just having their own separate styles of music. Here is what we've all been waiting for. It's time to talk, or at least tease a little bit of rock and roll, because rock and roll did not officially start really like become the official style of rock and roll until the late 50s. So, rock and roll originated from blues, jazz, rhythm and blues, and doo-wop. It was a type of popular dance music originally in the late 1950s, characterized by a heavy beat and simple melodies. Rock and roll was a mix of black rhythm and blues and white country music, usually based on a 12-bar structure and an instrumentation of guitar, bass, and drums. Sometimes piano when people decide that was a good idea. I'm not salty, okay? I just say that a lot of songs that are rock sound better with piano in them. I'm saying it, I'm putting it into the world, I'm trying to manifest it. Alright, so I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger of what's to come when I have to talk about every bit of rock and roll in the 50s and 60s. But I am very glad that I got to present this information to you again, and I'm glad that you guys like these videos because I have a lot of fun making them, and it's a very good learning experience for both me and you. I find it very interesting to just examine and kind of like depict what things we really needed in order to get to rock and roll, and I think it's interesting to see all these people who really contributed, because every tiny blues, jazz, doo-wop, whatever band or artist helped to create rock and roll, because just encouraging the idea of blues, jazz, rhythm and blues, doo-wop and skiffle and all that stuff, just encouraging that idea is a way to make rock and roll and rock and roll couldn't have really been the style that it is and that it was without all these different kinds of music. Even though I didn't talk about every single one, like I didn't even talk about country music because I have a personal vendetta against it, but it's fine. I didn't talk about some of the tiny like little genres of music because that would take forever that contributed to creating rock music. You can see how important it is for every genre to have existed before rock and roll in order for rock and roll to exist. I'm still going to talk more about all of the different versions of rock and roll and all that came from rock and roll after I talk about the original rock and roll itself. But yeah, so thank you all for watching, and I'll shook the table. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.